I'm Shahar Azani, and in the news, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and Israel. On February 5, the International Criminal Court presented its ruling on the question of jurisdiction in what is referred to by the court as the situation in Palestine. The court decided to accept the International Criminal Court prosecutor's position on the jurisdiction issue. It confirmed that Palestine is a state party to the statute, and additionally, it qualified, again, Palestine as the state on the territory of which the conduct in question occurred for the purposes of the statute. That means that the court's territorial jurisdiction in the situation in Palestine extends to the territories occupied by Israel since 1967, that is to say, that applies to Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. This decision, we have to state, was not unanimous. It was accepted against a dissenting opinion of Judge Peter Kovacs, who sharply criticized the majority's decision. To shed some light on the complexities of this issue, I am privileged to have with us today, all the way from Israel, Israeli attorney Yifa Segal. Yifa is currently the executive director of the International Legal Forum, a non-profit which is a proactive legal hub dedicated to fighting for justice in the legal sphere. It's a global cooperation mechanism between lawyers, organizations, and activists from all over the globe, providing them with knowledge, strategic planning, research, and the international network needed in order to effectively fight against radical ideologies, terror, and of course, the BDS movement that undermines the legitimacy of the State of Israel. In 2013 and 2014, Yifa was the joint director of Tatzpit Press Service, and while co-managing the news agency, she volunteered her time and skills in the legal battlefield, both in Israel and around the world. Prior to 2013, she was a leading member of Shurat Hadin, Israel Law Center. She has a BA in law from the University of Haifa and an MA in international relations from the University of Tel Aviv. Yifa, what a pleasure to have you with us today.
Wow, what an introduction, Shahar. I should ask you to do that every time. Wow.
That's the least we could do to share the incredible work that you're doing. And I'm so happy you're joining with us today to discuss this issue because it really is a complicated matter. But before we dive in, could you maybe share with our viewers a few words about the International Legal Forum? What is it? How long have you been around? And what is it that you do?
Okay, well, we've established the organization officially in 2016. And we thought of two things. One is that we should have a global fight against anti-Semitism that was and is still, unfortunately, on the rise. Also against terror financing, and this proliferation that also occurs around the world. And the third thing is the delegitimization campaign, the hate campaign, the demonization campaign against Israel, against Israelis, against Jews all over the world. So this was one thought that we had in mind. And the second thought was that we need to come together. We need to learn from each other. We need to consult with each other. We need to form coalitions, to share best practices. And this is why we've established the organization as a forum, as a hub for experts. And well, thank God it's been great. And there's a vast cooperation that is just growing around the world.
Well, could you describe one initiative that you have taken with the organization that you are especially proud of in the past couple of years?
There are, thank God, there are many. There is something that I feel is incredibly strategic, that we just filed in Canada, in Ontario Human Rights Tribunal this last July. And the issue is that we believe that oftentimes anti-Semitism today, modern anti-Semitism today, is masqueraded as anti-Zionism. People try to say that Zionism is nothing but a political ideology. Therefore, it should not be protected by the same protections that you have as a minority, as a Jew, or other minority have in Western liberal democracy judicial system. And so there was a case in Toronto. There was a restaurant that just blatantly put up a sign and a hashtag all over social media saying Zionists are not allowed. And for us, that was a clear-cut case of A, discrimination, and B, anti-Semitic discrimination, because it's more or less like saying Jews are not allowed, or at least the vast majority of Jews are not allowed. And so there was a Holocaust survivor, a woman, a brave woman, 86 years old, living in Toronto today, that she wanted to take action, and we've filed this lawsuit in the Human Rights Tribunal to represent her. It's the first time that this issue will be taken to court. We'll bring this in front of the court of law and say to them, you need to determine, especially based on the IRA definition, that this is completely anti-Semitic, and this is an anti-Semitic type of issue.
I'll just mention to our viewers that the IRA definition, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association that came up with this a few years ago, and ever since it's been continuously in the process of being adopted by different countries, the State Department here in the US, by different college campuses even, so that's very important to understand. And when it comes to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, well, you are venturing into the legal field, and all that we tend to use is the test of common sense. Many a time when people discuss Israel, simply replace the word Israel with the word Jew, and you really understand the nature of the argumentation and how often it is exactly as you say, Yifa, anti-Semitic to the core. Now, just touching upon the issue itself that we are dealing with here, the ICC, the International Criminal Court at The Hague, I just want to understand, there is an International Court of Justice already in The Hague. Is the International Criminal Court another one? Are they one and the same? What is it between them, and what's the difference?
There's a very big difference. The International Court of Justice is a place for states to come and settle disputes. So, for example, if there's a border dispute, if there's a certain treaty or a contract that was breached, certain obligation between states. So this is where they go and they can get a ruling on their dispute, a peaceful conflict resolution between states. The International Criminal Court is a completely different type of animal. And the criminal court was born. Actually, what people don't know is that the people that were most significant in pushing this idea forward were the Jews, were the Jewish state, based on the model of the Nuremberg trials and the horrors of the Holocaust. It were Jews that felt that we need an international body that can take the most heinous crimes of humanity, where there's no other recourse to take. So the international community needs to come together and create this establishment that will, that will provide some kind of an answer to terrible situations.
So not just as an ad hoc court for a specific crime, but an international criminal court that will oversee all of these kind of proceedings.
Exactly. So I'll give you an example. I think what these people had in mind was, when Assad is attacking his own people with sarin gas and executing civilians that way, then, because there's nothing to be done within Syria, because the system itself is corrupt and he is the dictator, then you will have some kind of an international tribunal that can help the poor civilians that are victimized by the situation. That was the original thought. And eventually, as it developed, it turned into something completely different. And there was
the International Criminal Court is relatively new, right?
Yes, the International Criminal Court was the Rome Treaty was established in the early 2000s. So this is a very, very new establishment, relatively very new establishment. And as the idea developed, there were concerns that were raised by many countries that this is turning into a political entity rather than this beautiful idea that we all had in mind, which is exactly why states like Israel, the United States, for example, and many others have decided that although this, to a great extent was something that they wanted to advance, they decided to stay out of it, not become signatories to the Rome Treaty.
When I'm listening to you, it kind of reminds me of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, where initially it was supposed to be born into, achieving justice, and it has become the lowest means of political tool. Even the then Secretary General Kofi Annan related to it back in the day, a decade ago, as a shameless political tool by states, and sometimes the most rogue regimes you have in the world.
The most rogue regimes you have in the world seem to be completely immune and they don't come before these tribunals or these establishments at all. And so I think today, 2021, we now see that, you know, the leaders that decided not to enter into the treaty had a point. They saw it coming. And unfortunately, it really proved itself to be a corrupt political entity rather than some kind of a beacon of light of justice onto the nations.
So just explain to us, we understand now what the ICC is. What exactly happened on Friday?
Well, what happened on Friday, let me tell you, was very, very dramatic, I think, not just in the Israeli context and not just for us as Israelis. I think international law was severely bruised, if not, more than that. And what happened is that the ICC, first of all, before looking into the specifics of whether or not alleged crimes were committed in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian context, first it had to determine on whether or not it has jurisdiction over the situation. And why is that important? Because as we said, the decision that was made eventually was that this court will not have universal jurisdiction. Only states, and I'm emphasizing this, only states that have entered into the Rome Treaty, that are parties to the court, can then provide, let's say, their authority over criminal situations or criminal jurisdiction to the court. And these are the only cases where the court can actually intervene. And why is this important?
So you have to be a state and you have to be a signatory to the Rome Convention, the two conditions.
Exactly. And the alleged crime must have happened inside the territory of your state. Why is this important? Because we mentioned the Assad regime and the chemical attacks and the murdering of civilians, for example. I mean, Syria is not a party to the Rome Treaty. Therefore, the court does not have jurisdiction. Just a month ago, the ICC came back with an answer that they're not going to look into the Uyghurs situation where the Chinese are herding, millions of people into concentration camps because China is not a member of the Rome Treaty. So basically,
let me stop you there. Who started the proceeding in the case of Israel and the Palestinians?
So the Palestinian Authority has officially lodged complaints against Israel. And, there were other NGOs and other people that used this as a part of their delegitimization campaign. But at the end of the day, the Palestinian Authority was the key player.
So instead of coming to the negotiating table, even though urged to come for years and years and years, they did not find the time to do that, but they did find the time to lodge a complaint at the International Criminal Court, which brought us to the situation we're discussing now.
Exactly. So they were too busy not answering the phone when, the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, and then Kerry's a peace offering on the table, and now Trump. So they were too busy doing other things like inciting terrorism and filing complaints with the International Criminal Court. And you're absolutely right. And so at the end of the day, the court had to come to decide on these two questions. Like we said, is this a state? And did these crimes were allegedly committed within the territory of that supposed Palestinian state? So you must understand, this is something that must be determined before you can even discuss the details of whether or not a certain situation amounted to a crime. This is a key issue. And so for a whole year, the court was deliberating on this. The prosecutor has already submitted her opinion to the court exactly a year ago. And there was a time for amicus, for friends of the court, for experts, for states to intervene. My group and several other groups also submitted amicus briefs to the court to make our statements on that regard. And just so you know, many worldly known experts on international law filed submissions to say there is no jurisdiction because there is no Palestinian state, and B, we don't know where the territory of that maybe future state will ever be, but it certainly does not exist today. And just to say, 7 other countries also submitted in favor of Israel. So that includes Germany, that includes Austria, Hungary, Australia, Canada, like major countries have submitted.
So in the course of the last year, the prosecutor presented her opinion that there should be jurisdiction for whatever reason. And at the same time, like you're mentioning, your organization, the International Legal Forum, and others presented their amicus briefs to the court, arguing otherwise, including some of the major world superpowers that you would mention, like Germany, Canada, and Australia. And they all share this position that the court has no jurisdiction.
Yes, exactly, 100%. And so comes Friday, and again, like Shahar, you and I know this. I mean, whenever the United Nations wants to do something that will harm Israel or harm the Jews, they always do it on Shabbat, or they always do it on a Jewish holiday, all the time.
Yeah, I have to say they've always been very observant.
Yes, yes. So this is the moment. They waited a year. By the way, they were supposed to come back with a response. The deadline was months ago, but they waited until now, and on the eve of Shabbat to basically say, to come back with an outrageous response. I mean, first of all, the majority, which were 2 judges, came back with a short and very, very simple, relatively simple analysis, basically saying, international law, all these different rules that we use to establish statehood, and all these different rules that we use to establish what's the territory and when and what and how, and these Oslo Accords that actually kind of regulate the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, and the entire world is a signatory to these agreements. That doesn't matter. We don't care about that. We're not even going to waste time analyzing that, because we don't care about that. What we care about is the fact that the General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly, which is a political entity. I mean, we all know that the United Nations cannot make international law. That's just it. We all know that. And the General Assembly has passed several resolutions to acknowledge the, let's say, the right of the Palestinian people to a future state based on the 1967 borders, but obviously depending on the outcome of negotiations, the recognition of Israel, security for Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So what the court does is ignores all of that and just says, you know what, the General Assembly has recognized Palestinian state, full stop. The Palestinians has been allowed to accede to the Rome Treaty, full stop, that's it. Shalom al Israel.
So you have a state, and you have a state that's a party to the Rome Treaty, to the statute, and the deeds occurred in the territory of that state, whatever that means in international law, and therefore the court has jurisdiction. So my question to you here is, to the best of my understanding, Israel is not a party to the Rome Convention, to the Rome Treaty. Does that have any implications here? Does it prevent the court from dealing with this issue?
Well, it should have prevented the court. This is a fundamental principle of the court. As Israel is not a state party, so the court should not have jurisdiction on Israeli nationals and on anything that has happened within the territory of Israel. So this is a complete, abuse of international law when they ignore the rules of international law to determine statehood. They ignore the rules of borders, and they ignore the fact that Israel is not a member state.
But they legitimize the move by putting a kosher stamp on the Palestinians.
Yes, based on a political decision made by the United Nations General Assembly. And let me just tell you, if you look back at those resolutions that were accepted by the General Assembly, then you see countries like Germany and other countries that now submitted in favor of Israel. They voted in favor or they abstained. So what happened? There's a really big difference between a country that is making a political decision and a country that knows that it's now determining, and changing the rule of international law. There's a whole level of responsibility. There's a whole scope of considerations that are completely different. So when these countries now come to realize that the court is planning to now take their political decision that was meant to, to only be used for this small thing and use it to absolutely change international law, now they stand up against it and say, whoa, this is not what we intended to do. And this decision actually might have, very, very dangerous ramifications, not just in the Israeli context, but in, for the entire world order, for that matter.
Let's start quickly with the issues of Israel. What does this decision mean immediately and to the future for IDF soldiers, officers, even Israeli politicians? Does it have any direct impact on their ability to travel globally or any other impact?
Well, it's very hard to say because we don't know. I can tell you my best guess, and others as well, obviously, is that we don't believe that they're gonna go after the low-ranking soldiers or individual civilians or any one of us. We assume that
can they at the moment, or it's just the beginning of a process?
It's the beginning of a process. I mean, you would still have to issue arrest warrants, and you will still have to justify arrest warrants. First of all, they have...
And the arrest warrants can only come if there is a decision that indeed the situation was such that war crimes were committed. So you have to reach a ruling on that issue, right?
No, it's not a ruling that you have to reach. I mean, just think about it, and like, you go to the police and you file a complaint, and then the prosecutor decides to issue an arrest warrant. You don't need a judgment for that. You just need to issue an arrest warrant. So there's still a process, right? There's still a process, and they still have to formally declare, the launching of an investigation, which hasn't happened yet. And looking at how effective, quote unquote, the court has been with other investigations, it takes them years to find, the piece of paper to do this or that. So I don't want to, open my mouth and, I don't want to make them go faster in the Israeli case, but, it's safe to say that it will probably take a while. And it's also safe to say that because of the objections that we see from the legal community, from the international community in regards to this judgment, if I can add a word, and let me tell you why I find this to be so dangerous, okay?
Yeah, because I want to ask you, now that we understand a little bit of the ramifications, it definitely sounds from what you're saying that this decision may have impact well beyond the Middle East and Israel. So if you can elaborate on this a little bit, that would be very enlightening.
Okay, so let me explain, give you one example. So the court says the Palestinians enjoy the right to self-determination, and this is why, this is basically, they're elevating this right above any other right in international law, and they're saying, okay, because you have the right of self-determination, you have the right to statehood, there you go, here's your territory, here's your state. So let me tell you something, have a look, just go Google, how many minority groups exist just in Europe. There are hundreds of minority groups, racial, ethnic, religious groups that all over the world. Just in Europe, as I said, I found hundreds of groups like that. Just take, for example, I don't know, the Basques or the Irish, or Bavaria from Germany that are trying to seek independence, or in northern Italy, and just, you name it, you have it. So if the court is now changing international law, meaning the right to self-determination was never equal to the right of statehood and independence. Obviously, I mean, minority groups, as we said, exist everywhere. But if now the court says, this is now the most important thing, you have the right to self-determination, then you have the right for a state. Not just that, we ignore the fact that you pick up arms, and we ignore the fact that you blow up buses, and we ignore the fact that you incite to violence, and we ignore the fact that you pay salaries to terrorists. The most important thing is that you have the right to self-determination. Everything else we don't care about. So you tell me, I mean, if you're now sitting in Ireland, for example, and you read this decision by the court, what are you going to do? Okay? Just imagine all of these minority groups in Europe, in other Western countries, and of course, all over the Middle East, all over Africa. What are the Kurds going to say? What is Quebec going to say? I mean, there are so many different complicated situations that are currently...
In principle, all of these minority groups may appeal to the court.
May appeal to the court, or worse than that, they can say, there's a long way to go, so we should start by blowing up buses, and we should start by paying terrorists, and we should start by, killing babies in their sleeps, just like the Palestinian terrorists are doing. And then, escalate, and we have the right to self-determination. This is what the court said, and nothing going to stand in our way. So just imagine.
Even though, Yifa, that the court made a decision at the same time to investigate Hamas, quote unquote.
So let me ask you something. What does this mean for Hamas, really? I mean, they're already a designated terrorist organization. I mean, Ismail Haniyeh cannot travel to London and have a beer right? I mean, he's on a terror.
More than welcome. I'm sure some will welcome him, but I can tell you that to me it was most antagonizing to even think about. When I hear such a counter argument, I think to myself, how can you even compare the state of Israel and Hamas and create this fake equivocation between two so incredibly different entities? And it brings to mind, and maybe that's a topic for another discussion, the movie Janin Janin and the massacre that happened, but not on the side of Israel, when Israel chose to sacrifice 13 warriors, and more than that, I think overall 23 soldiers during the defensive operation after the Second Intifada in Jenin back in 2002, after the Park Hotel bombing. And Israel made the decision to go into the camp and risk the IDF soldiers' lives just to avoid carpet bombing the entire camp. That's the state of Israel, and that cannot be compared in any way, shape, or form to Hamas.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And there's nothing for us to gain by, indictments being filed against Hamas. They are a terrorist organization. We are a democracy. We are above the law. They work, deliberately work in the darkest corners of the law or morality.
They do tend to work in the tunnels.
In the tunnels, yes.
So
exactly.
let me ask you before we conclude, the one last question that everybody now has on their mind, now that you've beautifully explained the quagmirical situation. What's next? What's next for Israel? What can be done to counter this decision by the court?
I think that we should stress. I mean, we should help inflame that outrage in the international community, because another point is that the court is basically saying, agreements or treaties do not need to be respected, because the Oslo Accords are obviously in effect, and the court has understood that and asked for clarifications on that. And so if they say, so what if you sign an agreement? So what if this is valid? So what if the international community is witness to that agreement? We still don't care. So basically, I think we should use the outrage, and there should be outrage, because you cannot ignore international law, and you cannot encourage bad actors to violate agreements and to bypass negotiations. So we should play on that outrage, and we should get countries that understand that, and we see that some countries understand that, to kind of work together on this. And hopefully, I mean, there's a new prosecutor that will be joining the ICC very soon. Hopefully, they'll make the right choice, a better choice, and the new prosecutor will understand, the gravity of the mistake that was made by this court. And I think that this is a real contribution to delegitimizing the court and kind of making all of us, the last of us, kind of, unfortunately, kind of rid ourselves of that beautiful dream that we used to have about an international criminal court. And we should fight. That's it. We should fight. There's a long way to go.
I just want to say a big thank you to you, Yifa, for your perspective, for your insight into this crucial issue for Israel and for the IDF, and for your incredible work and energy to promote the cause of justice in the world. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you so much, Shahar. It was great to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Israel is a state with a strong democratic system. It has international standing and recognition. It has always upheld the rule of law. As Yifa mentioned, state parties, including world-renowned experts, argued against the court's jurisdiction in this case. It is clear that the decision of the ICC is a distortion of international law, and it clearly turns the ICC into a political tool. Unfortunately, in this decision, we also see a violation by the ICC of the right of democracies to defend themselves against what are clear-cut acts of terrorism. And I believe that, sadly, this will not advance any prospects of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, but rather use to harden the positions of the two parties rather than bring them together, which should be the goal of the entire international community. But I think the great message that we heard today from Yifa is that Israel does not give up, nor will it this time. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and to all, stay safe and stay healthy. I'd like to thank our director, Sloan Copeland, our managing director, Dara Golob, technical manager, Michael Paley, transmission manager, John McDevitt, and to our wonderful producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. For JBS, I'm Shahar Azani. Until next time, see you soon, shalom, and lehitraot.